Well, George, could you tell us about the Rossland Club and your association with it as a boy?
Well, Jack, it's the first place that I ever remember living. My dad was steward there before Prohibition, and then after Prohibition, he went to work in the mines and stayed on as steward at the club part-time. And we lived on the upper floor. The club was a fairly large building. It took up all the area that is now the West Kootenay substation. It was a 3-story building on the front and 4 stories on the back. With the slope of the ground, the foundation of the substation is, you can still see the old rock work, which was the rock foundation of the club. Off to the south, the lawns, a 2-level lawn that was part of the club grounds, is still there. But as I said, it's the first place that I remember living, and the club itself was quite a show place. It was known all over the world. It had members who at various times had been in Rossland and had been club members and had kept up their membership. These were mining men who were traveling all over the world at the time. But not the ones that were away. I only know this from my dad. I know I remember a lot of the people that were around here at the time. Bruce Ritchie was a very strong member, and of course your own dad, Lorne Campbell, Mr. Dudney, who was bank manager at the time, Ted Applewhite, who was later an MPP, Sid Drury of the West Kootenay Power. In fact, practically all the senior staff of West Kootenay Power and a lot of Cominco staff, plus businessmen. But the building itself was, as I said, a show place. On the main floor, as you came in off Queen Street, was a small foyer with coat racks, and then you went into a main entrance hall with a large fireplace. Off that was a fairly large cloakroom and a washroom and lavatory, and then through an arch to another hallway with chairs, big easy chairs in it, and off that went a large billiard room with 2 full-sized Brunswick billiard tables and 2 fairly large card tables. And the walls of that room were almost completely lined with billiard cues, each in their own separate metal case with small padlocks. Various members, a lot of them had their own cues in these cases. And off the inner hall and with a door going into the billiard room was the old bar, which, as I say, it was past Prohibition, and I never saw it operated as a stand-up bar. There was a few lockers in there. It was about, I would say, about a 16 to 18-foot bar, highly polished. And then off on the south side of the second entrance hall, was what was called the smoking room. And it was a large room. I would estimate that would be probably 40 by maybe 35 to 40 by 20 or better. And it was, the whole club in fact was furnished basically in oak and mahogany with leather upholstery, and all the big easy chairs and rocking chairs were all carved with a lion's head motif on the arms. They were beautiful, heavy furniture. It was a shame to see them go. That, along with my dad's little office at the back of the bar, was the lower floor. And then off the front entrance hall, there was a 6-foot stairway, went up and doubled back, and the whole south side of the second floor was a double room with a large archway, and this was the reading room, and it was furnished, as I say, in the same way as the smoking room. Both these rooms had built-in divans of oak and leather under the windows too, and in the reading room there was a very large table on which all the major periodicals were kept, and smaller cases with encyclopedias and large atlases, and other books in there, and there was I would say about a 6-foot hall ran up the center of that second floor. On the north side, there was the secretary's office, and this was Mr. Gilmore, who was secretary all the time that I can remember. Next to it was a small card room with about a 6-foot circular table in, and then there was the main card room, which was a large room, possibly 25 by 12, and this was where the weekly Seven-Toed Pete game was held. I remember the regular players in there. There's, of those, about the only one that I can think that's still around is Jimmy Hunter. But there was Jimmy Jordan, there was Mr. Turnan, there was Ernie Morrison. One of my recollections of that was, what used to be a standard tale of that group was Jimmy Jordan, as you remember, was a Kentuckian or Georgian or something of the sort, and one of the favorite sayings in that group was, "Gentlemen, I has fulls." I always liked that. Then, on past that, there was just a lavatory at the end, and across the hall from that was a small room which we called a stationery room. It was stationery for the secretary and for my dad. And another thing that always sticks in my mind is that in those days, I guess cards were a lot cheaper than they are now. And a lot of times in the card game, there'd only be 2 or 3 hands played with a deck of cards, and then they'd be thrown out. And when we cleaned up in the morning, we just take these and stack them back in the stationery room, and I've seen as high as 600 and 700 decks of cards that had hardly been used in there. We used to keep every bridge club and whist club in the town supplied with cards. Then from there, the stairs went upstairs to what were our rooms, our living quarters upstairs. I would say in the early days, in fact, I know it had been a regular part of the club rooms, because the main central room up there had been a card room. And again, kind of thing that sticks in a kid's mind. One wall was a very large oil painting, and right in the middle of it was 2 bullet holes, which I was told at the time happened when somebody pulled a gun and somebody else knocked his arm up, and they put the bullet holes into the picture. And that was the 3 main stories. Then down on the what was the 4th story at the back was the main lavatory with wash basins and toilets, and the furnace room. The slope of the ground, there was very little space under the building up front, Queen Street. In fact, again, it brings recollections, because we used to have to put in a carload of coal. This was hot water heating throughout the whole building, and we used to have to put in a carload of coal each fall. And from the time I was about, I would say 10, it was my job to muck that coal back from the trapdoor as it came through, because I was the only one that could stand reasonably. It was only about 4 foot high up where it came in, and it sloped back to where in the back end it was 20 feet high. So this was my job, to muck this back to where somebody else could get it and fill it through. And just speaking of that, when the club burned, that coal was still burning in the fall of that year. The club burned in February, I guess it was, and we left here to go to Kimberley in September, and it was still burning then. And every once in a while, the fire department would have to come down and put some water on it. But I don't know how long it did burn after that, because we went to Kimberley.
The carload would be 40 tons, wouldn't it?
I think at that time it was 32 tons, if I remember rightly. But that was about what there was at the club. Of course, there was 2, on each floor, there was 2, they must have been 12-foot wide porches that ran the full length of the south side of the building. And my dad, before he came out here from the old country, had worked as a professional gardener, and this was something that he really loved, and he used to keep those porches just covered with boxes hung on the railings and boxes set on the floors and tubs. He had beautiful flowers. It was a show place. He also, in the main rooms inside, he kept indoor plants all the time and kept them through the winter. Took his own cuttings, and he had, he won quite a few prizes at various times in the old fall fairs over in Nelson, that kind of thing. But it was a beautiful place, and it was certainly a shame to see it burn. It was, as I said, it was furnished all in oak and mahogany and leather, and it was carpeted throughout, except for the cut it off.
Yeah. Okay.
The whole place, except for the bar and the billiard room, was carpeted throughout in heavy red carpeting, and the ceilings on the 2 main floors, I would judge they must have been on the first floor, about the main floor, about 18 feet. And on the second floor, there must have been 14, and every window was covered with heavy velvet drapes that swept right from the top of the window to the floor. And there was pictures in there, original oiled paintings. Of course, at the age I was then, I wasn't paying too much attention to that kind of thing, but I remember up in the reading room, there was one painting there which was an original painting of Sourdough Alley. Now, I can't think of the artist's name, but I know that I was told at the time that he had painted this, and during his lesser-known period, and he had been out in this country, and then he had gone back to the old country and become quite famous, but I can't for the life of me think what the name was. I don't think that I can think of anything too much more of interest as far as the club itself was concerned, Jack.
There was none of that stuff saved during the fire.
No. This, I think, was a decision. Mr. Gilmore, as I said, was secretary at the time, also one of the most prominent insurance men in town. And I think the feeling was that they would lose more on their insurance for what little they could get out. However, I think if anybody had been able to visualize the difference between then and today, and what that furniture and some of those things that were in there then would have meant if they'd been here today, because as I remember it, the whole thing was only insured for about $14,000. Of course, in those days, $14,000 was quite a lot of money. Today, you can't build a modest home. But this was my understanding of it, was that Mr. Gilmore decided that it couldn't get enough of it out to make it worthwhile, and it would just be lost on the insurance. They'd take a bigger loss on the insurance costs than what the value of what they would get out. And as I say, the value of the actual value of it as furniture is probably right, but the value of it as history, if it had come out, is where the big loss was.
Is that about all your recollections on the club?
I would think so, Jack. I think that pretty well takes in what there was in there.
Well, then perhaps you could search your memory back then to the two big fires of 27 and 29 and tell us what you recall there.
Well, again, of course, the on this, I think at some time you possibly should talk to my sister, Mrs. Sondry, because she has a phenomenal memory for this type of stuff. However, I do remember a considerable part of it. In both cases, both of the fires, I saw them very early. In fact, I was just coming, the first fire, I was just coming home from skating, an afternoon skating. I would say this was along 5 or a little after in the afternoon, possibly. And in order to go up to our rooms, you went straight along the full length of the hall on the second floor of the club and made a turn to go up the stairs to the third floor. Well, right at that turn was a window that faced out directly west towards the Allen Hotel. And you could see the back of all the buildings on Columbia Avenue on the south side. Well, as I turned, I just caught of the corner of my eye a flicker, and I stopped to look, and I saw this fire down at the back of what at that time was a building that owned by Billy McNeil, and he used it as storage for some material, and he had raised a few chickens and had a chicken run down at the back. The fire at that time, when I saw it, was very small. I don't imagine that it would be 10 feet square. So I called upstairs to Dad, and he took a look, and he started as fast as he could go to the nearest box. Was out on the corner at the Queen and Columbia, right the Co-op corner today. But he had just about hit the front of the club when Judge Pluman turned the alarm in. Well, as you will remember, that was all frame structure there, and it just spread like wildfire. They did have trouble with getting water on it. Some of the hydrants, I think, were frozen.
Yearly had a water shortage.
Yes, there was. Well, of course, there was too in the second fire. You kind of get crossed up between the two. There was some water because I can remember that night seeing Eldred Jewell up on the roof of the what at that time was the parish hall. It had been the old Betts and Audie store in years gone by, and Eldred was just soaking wet from where he had been in under a hose. He was, well, I think at that time that Eldred was actually working on the fire department. Again, I wouldn't swear to that, but of course, as you know, and I guess it's all better documented than I can remember, it took everything out from the corner of Washington Street to the parish hall, which was the only brick building in the block. That block, as I remembered it, there was a beauty parlor was the first thing on the corner across from the Allen Hotel, and then there was the old LD Cafe, and I think there was something else in there, in between there and Tommy Brown's store. Mr. Esling.
Do you have one of those buildings?
That was the old American Hotel. That was farther up. Judge Pluman and Esling, I think, were pretty well together, side by side. And then old Mrs. Ledoux had the old American Hotel. Next to that was McNeil's building. And then there was a big frame building that you remember Mrs. Donovan owned. And the parish hall next to that. Then I think there was the building that Mr. Gilmore was in. And again, that was a fairly large building. And then the corner block was the old Novak block. One thing that does stick in my memory, the Novak block, there was quite a few people living in there, and right on the top floor was a Watkins Products agency, and when they were afraid of the whole block going, they threw stuff out those windows, and there was the whole winter snow. At that time we had no snow loaders or anything of the sort, and the whole winter snow piled up from where the sidewalk had been shoveled off. I guess the snowbank out there must have been 12, 14 feet high, and they threw this stuff out. Well, in the spring when the snow started to melt. Um, this got to be quite a game for my sister and myself. We scavenged regularly every afternoon. Each day as the snow melted, there'd be a can of spice show up here and a bottle of vanilla someplace else. And we did quite a land office business in picking up Watkins products. Now we did pack up a lot of stuff on that first fire and have it ready to move. I don't remember that we actually moved anything out
This is from the club.
from the club. And but then the second fire, of course, it was later at night. Again, I think if I remember rightly, that I had just come home from a night skating session when the alarm went on that one, and I went over to see what it was. And at that time, it had started in a storage building about in the middle of the north side of the street, a storage building behind Irving Trimbath's confectionery store. And when I first saw it, this is all that it was, but that building was full of packing cases and Excelsior and this kind of stuff, real tinder. And as you mentioned, in that year we had a water shortage. The water had got too low in the reservoir and the mains had frozen. And they just weren't able to get water on it at all. And it spread and spread. And there is a few things about that are memorable. They took stuff out of most of the stores along that side of the street. They packed a lot of it over to the three buildings that were left on the south side, left from the first fire. A lot of it was piled right in the middle of the street. And then when the fire got up to what was old Mr. Weir's dry goods building, which was where Bob Van is today, they dynamited it to try and save the post office. And in so doing, it blew the windows out of the buildings on the opposite side of the street and blew the flame into these flame or sparks into these piles of material that were in the middle of the street, and also caught the fronts of these other buildings. And they started to go. Well, then the club was just across the alley from these three buildings, and I can't quite recollect whether they dynamited again in on that side of the street before the fire got to the club, whether that was what blew the fire club, although I doubt very much if the club could have been saved without, there was only a small trickle of water. I know there was enough water that my dad had a garden hose up on the roof of the billiard room part of the club. And shortly before that, at the time, in fact, at the time they dynamited the Weir building, I had been sitting up on the peak of the roof. We used to get out on the roof, the peak of the main roof, through a trap door, and I'd been sitting up there with a couple pails of water, and just if it looked like a spark would come down, throwing it at it. But I just don't remember the exact water situation. I know we had been very short. It seems to me that the domestic water supply was still running, but it was the main hydrant lines that were frozen up. But some of the people that were more adult than I was at the time would remember that.
Imagine the flames were really
Oh,
shooting up.
it.
Can you describe that?
I don't know how you would describe it, because I don't know how you would describe that. It almost would have to be seen. The wind on that second fire, in the early part of it, was generally blowing towards the north and west. And as I remember, it pretty well had everything flaming from where the fire started down to the blank wall of the bank building. And then the fire changed, or the wind changed almost completely around, and started to blow towards the south and east. And this is when it started to go towards the post office. And when they dynamited, they being blowing towards the south, of course, that helped for it to move across the street and take the other buildings. There is a few things about that too that sticks in my memory. I had, for 3 or 4 years, made a few dollars spending money by working for old Mr. McNeil, shoveling snow and dusting out the store in the mornings and that kind of thing, so that when this happened, this was the place that I logically went to, and I pretty well worked in there getting stuff out all the way through. But I know from stories that other people told me at the time, Sam Patterson, who ran the old Clarendon cigar store, Sam just walked in, picked up his cash register, put it under his arm, and said, "Help yourselves, boys." The fire was just that close. And there was fellows that had never smoked anything but Macons all their lives were smoking 4-bit cigars for quite a little while afterwards. Another thing that I remember, my aunt, Mrs. Irvin, they were running the Irvin Hotel at the time, and she got hold of a team and wagon and went up, and they took, I don't know whether it was 2 or 3 wagon loads or just what it was of J.C. Urquhart stock out, and they took them down, and that, I remember the next day, that was all piled right on the floor of the lobby down at the Irvin Hotel. I think this is pretty well what J.C. had to start up in business again when he started up again after the fire.
I recall too, that was the time of life when we had the horses for the fire department. There was no truck. Horse-drawn sleigh.
I think we still had the horses. I wouldn't swear to that, Jack, myself. But I think we did. Yeah. Yeah. It seems to me that it was still horse-drawn then. But that's something that I can't quite remember. As I say, again, I think probably that type of thing, my sister would remember it better than I do. I know we have talked of this before, and she remembers where everybody went after the fire. Mr. Urquhart opened up first in the corner of Jordan's store, in where Hayden Studio is now, and Mr. Weir went up, I think, approximately where the credit union is right now. Sam Patterson went into the corner of what is now Wise's, right next to the alley there. A business that was fairly new in the town at the time was in the lower floor right on the corner of the Novak block. That was the Marie Millinery. Jimmy and Marie Cooper had not been in business too long at that time. But I think that basically that, well, as you think along, probably other things come back, but basically that covers. I do recollect the following day just how stark everything looked. Next to the bank, the only thing that you could see was the vault in what had been Billy Baker's insurance office. And that vault, I understand, is the vault of Buterac's jewelry right at the present time. It was the new building was built around that vault. And then about the next thing in the whole block was the projection booth of the old Star Theater, just about in the middle of the block. And it was a concrete booth and stuck up on 4 concrete legs, and it stood up there, but everything else was leveled, and I think one of the worst sights was the what was left of the post office. As you remember, that prior to the fire, it had another floor other than what's on there now, and it was all built with turrets. That top floor was all built with was pretty fancy. They took that whole top off afterwards. And then over at on the opposite side of the street, there was a large chimney that had gone up 3 stories through the Novak building, was standing there, and the double fireplace on the main floor of the club, with a bit of the chimney above that. But it was a pretty bleak-looking place that following morning.
The Rossland Club, of course, would be quite a jolt for you.
Oh, very definitely, yes. In more ways than one, it had been home to us for as long as I could remember, and we managed to get very little out, even of our personal stuff. We did manage to get out some clothing, but I remember I was quite a reader as a kid, and I probably had about as good a kid's library of my own as you would want, because my parents and relatives, they knew that I loved to read, and these had been Christmas and birthday presents to me for years, and I had I had pretty well a complete set of Gene Stratton Porter, and I had all the Zane Grey novels and all this kind of stuff, and you remember the old Boys' Own Annual that used to come from England, and the Scouts Annual. I had those for years, and I had these all stocked away, but they all went up by well, and then, as I say, in more ways than one, too, because it was a second job for my dad. We had lived there, and we lived rent-free in the upper floor. I don't know just altogether what the financial arrangements were, but it meant going out, finding someplace else to live, and renting. And this is what we did until, it was only a couple months afterwards, actually. My dad had, when the mines had closed up here just shortly before, Dad was one of the last out of the mines, and he had gone to work down at the smelter, but he had never particularly liked it, and he was doing it largely because of the club. So it wasn't too long after the club burned that he asked for a transfer to Kimberley, and he went to Kimberley himself in April and then we followed him after in time to start the following year of school. But that meant building a house in Kimberley, and it was shocking more the ways than one, Todd.
Your father worked underground, did he?
Yes, he ran motor on the main level up here for quite a few years. The company, due to the club job, they kept him on a steady day shift. He had worked in the mines, and then I'm just a little hazy how it worked out. He worked for some years as a caretaker for West Kootenai Power. That's when West Kootenai when their main office was here. He worked over at the West Kootenai building for quite a little while, but then he finally went back up to the mines. And I just don't remember just how that came about, that he switched from one to the other. But I think that covers my recollections of it pretty well. I remember fairly well the various businesses that were along the street and that kind of thing, but this kind of stuff is all documented better than my recollections would be.
The first fire started from con pipes, didn't it?
That's right. Mr. McNeil, as I recollect, they had been thawing pipes in this building of his. It had frozen, and in those days we didn't have fiberglass and fiber rock and such like and so forth. Most insulation was sawdust, and he had been thawing pipes during the early part of the afternoon. And then he had gone back over the store. Well, I guess the stuff had started to smolder, because it must have been on somewhere after 5 o'clock, somewhere in that range anyway, that the fire actually broke out.
This would be with a blowtorch.
Yeah, with a blowtorch. Of course, as you know, this was standard procedure in those days. And to this day, I don't think anybody knows how the second fire started.
Was there not a lawsuit over that first one? Bob Stevens, did he not sue?
I remember something vaguely about that, Jack, but I don't remember anything definitely on that. Whether there was just talk of it or whether it actually went through or what, I couldn't say. I know there was something about that.
I can't recall. It should be in the papers.
Yes, I think it probably would be.
Oh, we got maybe 3-4 minutes of tape there, if you can think of anything else.
Well, I don't.
I'll let you think for a minute.
Yeah, go ahead. You want to ask something on?
Well, what do you remember about old Bismarck, George?
Well, I guess most of us kids remember Bismarck to some extent. He was quite a hermit, lived down in at that time, the old head frame of the old Spitzy mine stood on just off what is Cook Avenue now, and to the east of the railroad tracks. And he lived in there for years. I can remember some of us kids going down there one time when he wasn't there and looking through the place. He had 2 or 3 little corners with rags and scraps of old blankets and stuff that he seemed to use almost as nests. And he had the darndest collection of junk in there. One thing that I remember us seeing in there was an old Northwest mounted police coat, the real old Northwest red coat. But he used to scavenge through all the back alleys, the grocery stores and the butcher stores, and you'd see him going home dragging a box full of scraps he'd picked up behind the stores, and you'd also see him coming from various places with old tree trunks and tree branches that I guess he broke up and used for firewood down there, but I never did know what his actual nationality was. I think it is documented what his actual name was, but to us in those days, he looked like a fairly big man, but thinking back over it, I don't think he was. He always had a great bushy black beard and a mass of hair, and his clothes were always cast-offs, but as I remember, he was always a burly man. He certainly never seemed to be undernourished at all. He was a little different from old Mrs. Jess, who I guess you will remember very well too. She was his female counterpart pretty well. She did pretty well the same thing as far as scavenging around the stores. She did a little charwoman work. I think, if I remember rightly, she used to clean out Billy Baker's office. And she lived in a little old house out on the road towards the Durham Addition out there, the old Durham Addition Road. And she, again, was a real character. She always wore clothes of what I would guess was about the 1880, 1890 period, bonnets and skirts that didn't only come down to the ground, they dragged the ground all the time. And she was a little wisp of a woman, but I've seen her going along there after she had been out behind the butcher store or something with a crate and a rope tied to it and just striding right along, dragging this thing behind her on her way home. And she had the darndest collection of animals out around there too at various times.